I think anybody who ever does schoolwork has to be either open to uncertainty as well as the sort of art of possibility. In July, none of us had any idea that the Clinton administration was going to call and ask if they could sign a piece of charter legislation into law in the San Carlos School District where charter number 1 was. And lo and behold, you fast forward to September the 17th, and there comes President Clinton, the First Lady, Senator Boxer, you name an elected California Dem dignitary, and they were in the House, and only 250 people were allowed in this small multi-use room because the media had set up platforms to be able to capture this event. It was the president, followed by was First Lady, followed by the president, and then a roundtable conversation about charters. And so they wanted every media, TV station to carry that. So 250 people. I had been versed on the list, looked at the list, and had to vet this for the Secret Service or whatever they needed. And all of a sudden the day comes and it's a grand and glorious day. The day is over. I am reliving my life as a middle school principal, standing on the stage as the president and first lady worked the ropes, so to speak, kissed babies, shook hands. And I was glad that it was over. It was thrilling. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, a young man comes up to me and says, hey, I'm not an educator, but I like education, think it's really important, and wondering what you think if there'll ever be more than 100 charters in California. And my first reaction is, I don't know who you are. And as a superintendent, I tried to know everyone in town. And I said, how'd you get here? And he said, well, I just got on the list at the last minute. I made a small contribution to the Democratic Party. And that was about it. I didn't even ask him his name, but responded to his question that I think in 1997, California had 133 charters capped, was never going anywhere. The legislature was just never going to, consider more than 100. So he said, would you like to have lunch? So a couple weeks later, I said, sure, I'd have lunch. And the two of us met down in Menlo Park. And he described himself as an entrepreneur, a tech entrepreneur, which, I've been in Silicon Valley long enough to know that those creatures exist, and I knew of them and even met a few of them, but not this particular gentleman who said, back when you were starting the first charter in California in 1992, I was starting a software company that I started for $400,000. And this July, when President Clinton called you to ask about coming here, I sold my company for $752 million. We went out and had lunch, and by that time I learned that his name was Reed Hastings, and that he, after selling his company, couldn't do anything for a year. As part of the agreement for the sale, he had to go off and think about whatever it was he was going to do next. And I suspect that if you sold your company for $752 million, you probably would be okay for a year until you thought of the next thing. Which he said, I think between you, a pretty solid, seasoned public educator who sees the value of charters in the public school arena, and me, a businessman, we might actually be able to get something done. So we talked a little bit more about that, and by December of that year, we, along with a couple of other Silicon Valley venture capitalists, formed a 501c4 nonprofit political called Californians for Public School Excellence. I went to the San Carlos School Board and said, I'm thinking about doing this, and if I do it, with your permission, I'd like to take a leave of absence come January or February for 20% of my time. Essentially, I wouldn't be working for the district on Fridays, because when you do a political campaign, you obviously can't be paid with taxpayer funds, and had a very clear picture of what that would look like for me. And so by the end of January, we had literally filed our initiative, got our 75-word summary, and we were out on the road trying to collect 1.1 million signatures to qualify for a constitutional change in California. We had worked pretty diligently at that, trying to understand the political scene, the signature gathering scene, the process of how anything like this takes place. And so we would go to Sacramento every Friday. And we felt like the best thing we could do on Fridays was to begin to know the elected officials. Not that we thought anything was going to happen other than running the campaign, but you're going to need endorsements around running a proposition. So that was part of our goal. And by that time, people had heard somewhat of us, about us, that here are these two guys that are trying to expand charters, which had never been really thought about formally before. I must also say that many of the legislators during that time had heard of us from those folks who didn't think what we were doing was a very good idea. We were sort of characterized as wild or fanatical.